The following interview is a presentation of Ofiɔ Media. I actually want to ask you about your book, God and Money. If you could just briefly outline your proposal for the global currency that you've termed the Earth dollar, and also your argument for why there's a moral imperative for addressing the harm that exchange rate fluctuations cause to so many millions of the world's people.
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting question. Yeah, in my book, God and Money, which was published in 2008, I was looking at one ethical issue that the global monetary system, the global trade and payment system is basically run by three currencies. You have the dollar, the euro, and the yen, right? In the sense that the dollar is the world reserve currency, that the bulk of central bank savings are kept in dollar-denominated assets, and that everything is done through the dollar. And then in that book, I went on to look at the ethical implication, the exploitation involved in dealing with other countries. And then I said, but there could be a better way to organize the global monetary system in a way that is more democratic, rather than having these three powerful currencies and the rest of the currencies are plebeians, right? You have the princesses and the kings, those three currencies, and everybody is kind of playing the plebeian role. That how can we create a more democratic payment system that is not controlled by one country at the expense of the rest of the world, right? Of course, there are issues about what they call the trifle dilemma. If you are controlling the world currency, that is a different. But basically, it's not a democratic system, and it's not. I'm declaring not democratic because I'm the first person to do so. No, people knew it, right? So, give us a bit of historical context. When the Allied power in 1944 felt the global monetary system was broken down and they wanted to reorganize it, they met in a place not very far from where I live, in New Hampshire, in the state of New Hampshire, called a holiday resort called Bretton Woods. That's why it got the name Bretton Woods Institutions for the IMF and the World Bank. So they met there to redesign the global monetary system. At that time, the president of Roosevelt and the British government, Churchill, have met, they've exchanged, and then they've asked John Maynard Keynes to come up with a plan that will be democratic and fair to everybody. And Keynes came up with a plan called the Banco Plan, BANCOR, Banco Plan, which should be democratic. And they seem to have agreed. Then the Assistant Secretary of Treasury, Harry White, went up to Roosevelt and paraphrasing, he told him, "Are you crazy? We just won the war, and there is power in having the number one currency being an American currency, the global reserve kept there. How could you give that power away to create a global currency? Basically, are you crazy?" I'm paraphrasing. So Roosevelt then sent a telex to Keynes. Keynes was on the way on the ship. He said, we are no more doing it. We are no more creating the. We are going to use the dollar as a global currency, and everybody has to save their national assets through the global currency system. Of course, they make sure that America had the goal to back it up, right? But of course, when America began to run deficit from 1958 to 1971, when Nixon finally delinked the dollar from gold. But the Banco Plan was a much more democratic way of running the global monetary system. Of course, once America rejected it, America was the global economic power, was the global nuclear power, was the global military power. No one could, all the European powers were already broken and beaten in the war. American view prevailed. So what I came up later by the 2006 when I was writing that book to say, we could go back and visit that concept. Because we're in the global era, and when even the former head of the Federal Reserve has said that a global economy needs a global currency. So I went back and I said, okay, let us reconceive this. What are the ethical, philosophically, how do we reconceive it? Because I also know that all through history, different countries have come up and ruled the world through its currency, having the main reserve currency. And America should have stepped in that position at the end of the First World War, but didn't want to do it because he didn't want to take the responsibility of being the lender of last resort. If your currency is number one currency, the currency of reserve, you have to be the lender of last resort, and it will drain your economy. America didn't want to do it until the Second World War, and Britain was in no position to do it, and America stepped in. And I said, if you look at all the indices, China is where America was at the end of the First World War. And so history tells us that at some point, the Chinese yuan is going to be the global currency of the world. And the fact is that for the last 500 years, Western civilization, European countries have always produced the global currency. And history also tells us that the shifting of global currency from one country to the other have often come up after a major war. Now, the question is America and the West ready to democratize the system, or they're going to wait for the Chinese to take over, right? The China is not ready right now because it is still preparing, because in the book I gave the different conditions under which that kind of power will emerge, and China is gradually getting there. But economically, it's already, it accumulates more surplus than any other country in the world. This was where America was at the turn of the first century. So eventually, my theory is that China may emerge as the global currency. Will the Western power, for the first time in 500 years, allow an Asian power to play that role? When everybody knows the power and the influence and the dominance that role gives the person, will Europeans be ready to hand that over to China? Or at some point they're going to say, okay, let's have a democratic system before China takes over? Because it's not a question of if, it's when, given the way China has grown and accumulated the trade surpluses or so, that Chinese currency at some point have to be the number one currency in the world. Of course, you also need military power to support it. And China is also building up the military power. It's also building up raw material, access to raw materials all over the world. So it's not a question of when, if it will happen, when it will happen. My thing about writing that book is to say, okay, let us now democratize the system, just as Britain, when it fell out of power, didn't want America to exploit it in that way, came up with that plan, but eventually American national interests take over. We're also at a different cups of history that says, let us do something about that global power. And so that is the ethical and historical dilemma that I was working through in that book. So I came up with a notion of a world currency that we use for trading across the world. I call it Earth dollar. So it's not an American dollar. It belongs to the whole Earth. I just came up with that name, and it sounds good to me that it's something that belongs to everyone on the Earth, right? We have the concept of the Earth dollar. And the way I talked about the design of that currency was that it is going to be fully decentralized. It's not going to be controlled by any one nation. And so at that time, in part of the book, I was critiquing Hart and Negri's notion of the empire. And I came up with, I used the computer language that the monetary system in the world is like the computer architecture master-slave. But a truly innovative monetary system will be peer-to-peer control, right? Peer-to-peer control, so there is no one node that controls everything. Peer-to-peer control is completely decentralized. It will be used for international transactions, but nations can still use their local currency within their borders for the international. And then it will be designed in a way that if a nation is accumulating too much trade surplus at the expense of others that are running deficit, there should be some kind of mechanism to balance things out. So we don't have excess deficit in one end and asset surplus. That's what creates this kind of imbalance. That's what my concept was. And recently I've been reading about the concept of the cryptocurrency and the bitcoins, right? And I find that in that sense of decentralized peer-to-peer network system as a basis of organizing a currency that is not controlled by any one person, right, is something that, at least philosophically, works with this idea of, especially the bitcoins, about that. Even though mine still have the bitcoin idea, doesn't have the nation states anymore, right? That you don't have the nation state currency, but mine was in the nation states are still there. They perform good functions. They do their currency, but the control of the money for trade, international trade, is not in the hands of any power. So no one can use it to intimidate other nations to follow their path. To give you one example, I quoted a Wall Street Journal article in the 70s or so. Germany wanted to diversify its foreign reserve out of the US dollar because it felt the US dollar was losing value. What did the US government say? If you get out of the dollar, we are going to withdraw our troops in Berlin then, and then you are going to be communist or so. In the 90s, early 2000s, South Korea also wanted to diversify. It announced, like today, the next day, it came back to change its mind because according to the report, the US government has said, you cannot do that. Because they need people to hold the currency. That's what gives it importance. And one importance it gives to the US is that the US is the only country that can print its currency and pay another person. And so there was a story I quoted in the book during the Iraqi war by the Guardian of London, where US could just print money, put it on a plane, take it to Iraq, and pay people directly. And then all it does is to do the accounting work and balance the book. But if any country like Nigeria has to buy any good, let's say 1 million, it has to first dig up enough oil to sell, to acquire the dollar, to do whatever it wants to do. Every country is subject to it. China, to accumulate the 1 trillion it has in the US in reserve, has to sell that much goods to the US. But the US can literally print its own currency because the world agreed that US currency was going to be the currency. And then when the world agreed, it tied the US, so that US will not misuse that opportunity. It tied the production of the dollar to gold being backed up. And that's why US government was keeping gold at Fort Knox. That's why at some point in the 50s and 60s, they even banned the use of gold because US couldn't have enough gold to back up the gold. But Nixon one day realized, hey, what can happen to the US, right? They're not going to obey that agreement. And he delinked that in 1971 and says, we are no more interested in that. And no one could call the US to order. So now US can print as much dollar as it wants to do whatever. And then when it runs into deficit, what does it do? It sells its treasury notes, and the rest of the world, because they're keeping their assets in the US, would buy up those treasury notes and they keep going into debt. But no other power in the world has that kind of authority. And that is the question. Are we going to democratize? And for some people who may find this democracy of the international currency a little bit abstract for them to understand, let me make one local example. Imagine that we are over 300 million in the US. And if you, Adam, is the only one that can write to a signature on a piece of paper, and everybody will accept it as money, you are the only one that can do it. Right? So if you want $10 million, if you want to buy a house of $10 million, all you do is to bring out a piece of paper, sign your signature, and you give it to somebody. The owner of the house is going to give you the house. You're the only one that has that power. But every other person to accumulate even $1, not talk of $10, has to walk their tails off because they have to earn it from somebody. You are the only one that has that power. Imagine what that does to you. You can wake up and one day say, you want to buy Apple, Google, all of them one day together because you can print that money. You can do whatever you want. Or you're the only one that can borrow at such a level that everybody's pouring their money onto you. That is a lot of power at the individual level. That is what we're experiencing at the international level with the US national currency. And so, and to think about it, one cruel example is this, right? Even poor Haiti has to keep their meager national reserves in the US. Iraq has to do the same thing. Iran has to do the same. Even though we say we are fighting them, they have to keep their reserves here, and it helps to lower even our student loans or our mortgage, the interest rates on our mortgage, because every country stores their wealth here. And so we are saying we are giving aid to other countries. That is true. But ask them, where are their national savings? So if you go to Nigeria, the banks will suck up those savings from the rural area to a regional bank, to a national bank, and they would buy assets in the US here. But that is on the individual private market. But the national reserves, the money that the country had to keep aside to trade and pay for its import or so, has to be kept in dollar. Whether you are fighting with the US or not, you have to keep that money in dollar. That is agreement, and the dollar is the reserve currency. So you save, every nation saves their money in dollar, and that dollar is sitting down in the US banks, which means we are benefiting from it in terms that much money in means that it lowers our average interest rate in this country. So we, as a rich country, is benefiting from the savings of poor countries like Haiti or Myanmar. I mean, so how could any ethicist or philosopher or economist not pay attention to this kind of inequality in the global payment system? So that's what that book is, the book God and Money is meant to address.
Yeah, thank you so much for that explanation. You touched on something else that I want to ask about, at the risk of maybe asking you to repeat one or two things, but hopefully not very much. I want to get your reaction to a rather similar proposal, actually, not identical, but one that has similar features, by Yanis Varoufakis, who is a European economist and sort of EU politician at this point. I think he was a Greek politician and sort of now has moved up to the EU level. And I'll preface the question because you mentioned Bitcoin, and this question kind of touches on cryptocurrencies a little bit too. I'll preface it by saying that Varoufakis has made it pretty clear that his position on sort of any state adopting a crypto, not a cryptocurrency standard, but a Bitcoin standard or a standard around some cryptocurrency that the state doesn't have the power to issue. His position is that that's catastrophic because there are certain times when governments need to be able to inject capital into certain sectors, in times of economic downturn or whatever. But Varoufakis wrote actually a proposal for a global currency, sort of in response to the news that Facebook was trying to establish a global payments network, which incidentally, was a network that might have challenged the monetary sovereignty of some countries in the global South. But in case you haven't read the piece, and for the benefit of our listeners too, I'll just quote briefly from it. Varoufakis writes that the IMF could issue a blockchain-based Libra-like token, Libra being the original name of the Facebook project. For his purposes, he's calling it Cosmos, whose exchange rate with domestic currencies floats freely. People continue to use their domestic currency, but all cross-border trade and capital transfers are denominated in Cosmos and pass through their central bank's account held at the IMF, which I know is also a feature of your proposal in God and Money. He goes on, trade deficits and surpluses incur a trade imbalance levy, while private financial institutions pay a fee in proportion to any surge of outward capital flows. These penalties accrue in a Cosmos-denominated IMF account that operates as a global sovereign wealth fund. Suddenly, all international transactions become frictionless and fully transparent, while small but significant penalties keep trade and capital imbalances in check, and through the sovereign wealth fund green investment and remedial north-south wealth distribution. So your reaction?
No, my reaction is two things. That's exactly what the $8 was meant to do, right? That's what all the features is saying about controlling trading balance, that the Libra or the Cosmos trade between nations. That's exactly what the $8 was going to do, or is designed to do. Probably he has not read my work. The only difference is that when I was writing in the first 5 years of the 21st century, the book came out in 2008, the concept of blockchain was not something available to me. After the Bitcoin, Satoshi came out with the Bitcoin in 2009, and my book had already been out. So the idea, but I was looking at it in a currency that they could arrange, even though I didn't go into the technology, but exactly what is talking about the Libra or the Cosmos. That's why the $8 was supposed to do. It's interesting that he calls his own Cosmos. I called my own $8. That's what he's supposed to do. But now he says, okay, that is a form to issue it. At the same time, mine too was not based on, eventually backed by some gold standard, as some people have argued. So it's this, as I said, it could be done, it could be issued, right? But he now wants to issue it in a technologically more advanced way. And that, so there are similarities in the concept, except the technology of doing it. And of course, he also talked about balances and imbalance, which is also in my book. Now, why are we so similar? Because maybe one could say that is the original idea that Emma Watkins had. I don't know whether if he has read the Bako plan. What I was doing was to reconceive the Bako plan in more modern language. After 50 years, it was done. And so all these features that he mentioned, anybody who has read Bako plan will say that there is really nothing new there, because all those features are part of the Bako plan that came. Because another people came before and thought about this project. But what is new in this proposal, which is commendable, is this idea of blockchain. Because if one has read the blockchain and the way it works, yes, it's not easily adaptable to any control. But what is also similar between his work, Ken's work, the Bako plan, and mine, is that all these three plans have not still found a way, or the authors, including me, don't believe that the nation state should go away. But if you read some of the writers, the bloggers on Bitcoins, they feel like nation states will just go away. But there are issues about who is going to be the lender of last resort. And that's why, for me, I said, we need an IMF-like institution. We can call it any name you want to be able to do that. And actually, IMF also have tried this, what I call the $8 or some form of Bako plan, or what he's calling this Cosmo currency, in the form of what called a special drawing right, SDR. So they were experimenting about this basket of currency and then adjusting the price, and everybody the price floating. Now there's also a difference with his plan. He said the national rate should be allowed to float very freely. Then if it's floated freely, then why would you want to charge anybody? In mine, I said maybe national currency could float within a certain range, kind of being fixed and completely free as for national currency, while any other rates within the nations could be allowed to float freely. But those kinds of international decisions should have certain band, so that way people don't excessively gather surpluses or deficit, because anytime those kinds of imbalances occur, you have to make the system readjust itself. And he's saying, fine, and I agree with him, that you need some kind of fees or penalty to bring people together. In a system where, like China, is accumulating so much surplus. Why? But a system should be able to say, okay, if you are accumulating this much surplus, I mean, you are sucking it from the rest of the world. At what point do we begin to? We're not going to take your money away from you, but we begin to seek for some ways of imbalance, and people have to be ready to pay that price, right? So people say, well, the Greek when the Greek thing happened, well, the Greek crisis happened. It was part of euro, but you could see part of the problem was that the adjustment mechanism with the euro, with the Greek, wasn't well calibrated. So Germany was accumulating so much surplus. Greek was going down in deficit, and there was no one calling the system to order before it gets out of hand until it went into the crisis, right? So this kind of system will have to be something that the world agrees to work things out. Just like the United States, we said we have X number of seats in the House, and we just came out with the census, right? And we do adjustment. Which states will get more seats when things move, or which states will get less. So a system has to find a way to adjust itself. So I applaud, his plan, because it's also designed to tackle the inequities or the unethical things, right? So what my plan, my book, since I had writing for ethicists in mind, or economic ethicists, right? I was much more explicit on the ethical implication and the benefits and the payoff there. But you could see this is at the end that Keynes from the 1944 is been going around, that there needs to be a way to address the global monetary system in a way that it will benefit everybody. So I've not read his stuff, but from the part you read to me, assures me that it's within the ballpark. And if he also reads my God and Money, he will find some similarities. Yes.